Welcome to Knowing Your Way, a Princess Margaret ovarian cancer podcast. Many of us with cancer diagnoses spend time thinking about how our children are coping with the knowledge that their mothers have serious illness. I think that this is particularly true as cancer is now often considered a chronic disease, interrupted by recurrences, often but not always amenable to treatment. Today, my two guests and I will talk about these very real concerns and how best to go about addressing them with some of the people that we love most in this world, our children. I'm very, very pleased to have Cynthia Mulligan and Andrea Warnick with me today. Cynthia is a well-known senior reporter with CityNews who is receiving treatment for stage 4 breast cancer, having first been diagnosed over 11 years ago. Andrea is a registered psychotherapist and nurse with over 20 years of experience supporting grieving children, families, and communities. Welcome and thank you. Hello. So first of all, Cynthia, how are you doing?
I'm doing really well. I was re-diagnosed almost just shy of 2 years ago. It came as a shock because I had been so incredibly healthy and doing so well, and there were no symptoms, but it was found quite by accident in a scan, an annual scan. And I'm now on a clinical trial. So it's stage 4. I had 2 spots in my liver that they discovered 2 years ago. I'm on a clinical trial that so far is incredibly successful, and it's been shrinking the 2 very small tumors. They're almost invisible in the latest CT scan. But to be perfectly honest, I live with the knowledge that these drugs, eventually the cancer will overcome the drugs. And one of the drugs that I'm on, palbociclib, my oncologist has told me has a general success rate of about 2.5 years. And I've been on it, this February, it will be 2 years. So that sort of hangs over your head. But I grab every day and try to grab every day with passion and optimism and hope, which I have. But it's still a reality.
Yeah.
That I try and keep in a dark corner, tucked away.
It's amazing how we can live our everyday lives and find joy in our everyday lives and validation and all those other kinds of things. But then almost at the same time, there's this knowledge, right? And this concern and worry.
And it adds maybe a poignancy is perhaps the right word, but a greater appreciation for life and the beauty of life and the all the wonderful things. So it's one of those interesting situations where it does bring you a lot of joy and gifts and appreciation and love. But it also, late at night, sometimes you're up thinking about it.
Yeah. And we're often late at night thinking about how the diagnosis is affecting our kids as well.
Absolutely. Because at the same time, I would be lying if I didn't say these drugs, they're hard. They're hard. They take a toll in terms of your energy level, how you're feeling. I have no immune system, so I'm always worried about it's not even COVID. It's like getting the flu or a cold because it just knocks you out. And when you're already not feeling 100%, the last thing you need is to feel sick. And it's more from a mental health perspective as well. So you're juggling a lot of things on top of your children and your family and the people that you're trying to protect. And, I'm really busy with my career. So it's a fair bit of juggling. Yeah. And I'm being really honest, and I'm not this honest very often.
Yeah, sure. Well, I bet that honesty goes a long ways in helping you manage your children, your daughters who are 17 and 19?
19 and 22.
21. Okay. Yeah. So, Andrea, we've been talking about the value of honesty and open communication with our children as a means of helping them cope with these serious illnesses. Do you want to share that with our listeners and with Cynthia?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that we know, and I saw it both in my nursing career and as a therapist now, but that kids benefit from just having honesty, and I think part of what can make that really hard with a cancer diagnosis is most often family members, like their biggest instinct is to protect their kids. It's coming from such a good place. And where I think that it can sometimes lead people astray is thinking that, well, I'm going to protect them by withholding information. Right. And so I'm going to keep them from the information. And, when I'm working with kids, one of the first things I always ask is like, so I'm wondering, how did you find out about your mom's cancer diagnosis? And kids are little detectives. Like I could write a book of all the things kids have told me about how they put the pieces together. Right. And sometimes it's the family came forth and had a conversation with it about it. But my general guidelines or guidance to families is like, we always ideally want kids learning from their parents first, whether it's about the diagnosis, whether there's changes in the diagnosis. And there's literature that really backs this up. Like that reinforces trust, which is one of the biggest resilience factors for any kids. And I'm talking about 4-year-old kids, and I'm talking about 24 and 44-year-old kids as well.
Yeah. Interesting. We had been talking earlier about Terry Fox, who many people, young people know, obviously, from school and all the events that surround this amazing person who unfortunately died of his cancer. And can you tell us about the perspective then on cancer that children may have that needs to be shifted a little bit?
Yeah, I find one of the things, Terry Fox is such a beautiful legacy story, but I find quite often when I'm sitting in my kids' school listening to those presentations, there's never the broader perspective of, and many people get cancer and survive. And many people get cancer, and now we have treatments where it may be more like a chronic illness where they live for a long time. And so my experience in Canada is that any child who's in the public school system, like 3.5 or 4 years up, they connect cancer with death. And when I'm working with families, whether it's their child who has cancer, because my background is pediatric oncology nursing as well, or it's a parent who has cancer, that presents a real barrier for a lot of people where they're like sometimes not even wanting to use the word cancer because they're worried about the association and that their child will think death. And, quite often what I'll suggest to them is actually most kids can handle the gray, right? It's a little bit of education to provide and make sure when we're talking about it to help them have a broader understanding of the fact that sometimes people get cancer and die from it. Sometimes people live with it for a long time and then die from it. And sometimes people survive and it totally goes away.
Yeah. Cynthia,
but I would say in society, if I could just jump in.
Sure.
When I tell people that I have stage 4 cancer, they ought, and regardless of age, the general feel and the look on their faces, they think I'm going to die very quickly. In fact, somebody even said to me recently at an event, I really feel for you because you're facing imminent death. And it's like, wait a minute, no, I'm not. Like, and when I said earlier that one of the drugs tends to only last 2.5 years, that doesn't mean there aren't other treatment options. We just have to find the next one. Yeah. So it is fascinating. People tend to write you off when you tell them you have cancer, regardless of age.
Yeah,
I refuse to be written off.
Exactly, for sure. And that's part of the reason we're doing this podcast. I've been living with this disease for 7 years, and that's a pretty good record, for someone with ovarian cancer. And I'm doing well. I'm living a very fulfilled life, and I want our listeners to know that this is a chronic disease. For some, unfortunately, the end comes sooner, but for many it doesn't, and we can live very enriched lives. Cynthia, in your case with your daughters, how was that communication that took place? Your situation is interesting because they were quite young when you were initially diagnosed, and now they're young women.
Yes.
Can you describe it a little bit?
So when I told them the first time, they were 6 and 10. And I was very honest with them, but Andrea, you may tell me I approached this completely the wrong way, but I think it differs for every family and every situation. I hope you would agree with me on that. I hope I haven't made any mistakes, but I wanted to teach them about this, and I I didn't want it entirely wrapped in fear. I wanted them to understand the reality, but also show them what hope and resiliency and friendship, because my friends rallied around me, and I wanted them to have good memories of this as well, not just bad ones. And I knew I was going to look sick and feel sick after chemo treatments, but when I went for my first one, and my girlfriends were with me, and my daughters, of course, couldn't come to the hospital with me. My youngest gave me a tiara, and she said, "Mommy, would you wear this every chemo?" And I did, right? And recently, because of this podcast, I said to them, "What do you remember about those days?" And they both said, you made it fun, and you took a lot of the fear away. They remember my friends, they remember the tiara, and they remember, that yes, I was tired, but they didn't remember it as a horrible thing. So I that made me really happy. This time round, it felt harder to tell them. And also because I got the diagnosis 2 days before Christmas. So, it's already a very emotional time of beauty, right? And my daughter had come home from university, and I didn't tell them 2 days before Christmas. I couldn't do it. So I waited until I knew what my treatment plan was going to be. And I mean, you get the diagnosis, and that's full of fear and unknowns, and you don't know what that looks like yet. So I wanted more knowledge so that I could say, okay, this is what's happened. And they knew I had been going for tests. They knew there was something funky with one of the tests. So it didn't come completely out of the blue, but I waited until I got my treatment protocol and I knew what that was going to look like before I told them, because, and as much for me as for them, to be perfectly honest. Right. But that Christmas was tough, not telling them. And we have this tradition where every year I buy them children's Christmas books, and we have now a stack, and we do this fun thing where, a few days before Christmas, I'll say, "What's at the door? I think I just heard something." And then it's the elves have dropped off Santa's books for them, and it's signed by Santa. And so every year we read a few of them. And I remember just like crying, like tears pouring down my face, and I'm trying to wipe them away so they don't see. But when I did tell them, they were incredible. And that's a learning thing for me, because to your point, they're young women, and they're incredible young women, and cancer is not a stranger to them. So they listened, they asked questions. I answered as honestly as I could. And it was great. It was really great. And what I notice is it's what has shifted is they're not little girls anymore. And I've had to relearn this and understand this myself. They're not tiny little girls anymore. They're young women who want to help me and be there for me. And I'm still learning to allow them to be, because my instinct is to protect them from it all and say, "It's okay. I'm good. I'm super mom. I can handle anything, and you don't need to worry about me." And they have asked me specifically to be more honest and tell them when I'm not feeling well, if I'm having a bad day. And it's a really interesting shift in the dynamic.
Yeah, it's really beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. I was reflecting on, our situation at home, and the evolution too, and the growth I think that took place on my part, learning from my children, hearing them describe their experience. We have another podcast on breaking news of a new diagnosis to those you love. And my son was so eloquent and so mature in his description too of what he had gained from this whole experience, not only for himself, but also in his relationship with his sister. It's been a phenomenal experience that way.
Yeah. Just a little story, and I hope I'm not talking too much endlessly here.
Please,
when I was going through chemo, of course, you lose your hair and your eyebrows and your eyelashes, and my daughters and I used to count how many eyelashes I had left, right? And we got down to 1 or 2, right? But it was almost a game, and I hid that, I actually hated losing my eyelashes from them. And now with the new treatment, for some reason, I'm losing my just this eyebrow. Like I look like a cat has, I've been in an alley cat fight and I've been scratched here and I'm missing this eyebrow. And it kind of bugs me a little bit because, you wake up in the morning, it's just like, oh yeah. And it's so trivial. But I said to my 19-year-old, I'm losing my eyebrow. Like I was vulnerable with her, right? And I said, I'm losing my eyebrow and it's bothering me. And she just gave me the biggest hug. Yeah. And I thought, wow, this has changed, and I really thought it was the most beautiful thing where she understood and she was comforting me. Mm-hmm. So, the lesson is to allow them to do that, because I think that helps them grow and gives them some control as well. Would you agree, Andrea?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's actually this interesting research. This is in parents who have actually had a child die, but it's called, totally overly academic, but partner-oriented self-regulation. And they found when either of the grieving parents tried to withhold their own grief from each other in an effort to protect, it actually complicated things and made it much worse. And I always say to people, I see that intergenerationally all the time. Mm-hmm. And that's where the thing is as much as you as a parent want to protect your kids also have those instincts and want to protect you. Mm-hmm. And I actually think, I love Brene Brown's TED Talk on the power of vulnerability, because she really speaks to that actually being an important quality with strong research behind it for us to learn how to do as adults in our life, to allow ourselves to be vulnerable sometimes, model grief, and allow our children, not in a parentified way, but to do exactly what you did, Cynthia, right? Like tell her it's hard and let her comfort you. Yeah. I think it's beautiful.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah. That from the early days of this diagnosis, I did say to myself that I did want to be a role model. And I guess I never really thought about being a role model in this regard, making myself vulnerable.
Yes.
But it turned out to be that way, so similar to you, Cynthia, there's nothing that I love more than a big, big bear hug from my son, right? Yeah. Or my daughter, Caroline, also making light of what could be a bit of a downer situation. Mm-hmm. Both of them can do that now because they're older, and because maybe similar to your kids, maybe they started off on the right ground too, like with the right foundation, and it helped them when the recurrences were diagnosed in both you and myself. And this is what I hope that our listeners can take from the conversation. I wanted to ask you, Andrea, what about those situations where kids, well, at least parents sense that their one or all of their children may have a problem receiving the information, and they might shut down and not really want to talk about what's going on?
For me, this is why I encourage people to talk early, where it's not sort of a crisis situation. We have to have the conversation, because anybody with multiple kids is going to have them processing in different ways, right? And that's where I think, and I heard you saying this, Cynthia, that your kids are asking you lots of questions, which I think is awesome, because that's one of the things I say the best things we can do is create an environment where kids, no matter what age they are, know that they can ask any of their questions. Anything goes. Like, even if they're asking or wondering about the biggest most worrisome things, I'd rather them do that out loud than carrying that themselves. Right. And that's where, when we open the conversations up, if you've got a kid who's shutting down and saying no more, like that's it, then you've got time. Let them process, right? Revisit, never force. You don't want to dump information on them, but you want to support them, right? Let them know it's okay for this to be hard. And when they're ready to talk or want more information, they're welcome to come to you. And sometimes, like, I like to give kids back a little bit of power in these situations too. How do you like to get your information? If things were changing with me, would you like us to sit down all together and have this conversation? Is it easier for you one-on-one? Right? Some kids, actually, I've got kids in my practice who they like going and talking to the oncologist, and they've got their own list of questions that they're not going to ask their parent, but they'll ask the oncologist. We do this ask the doctor session, which I love. Mm-hmm. So I think that, it's making space if they need to shut down and they're not ready for all of the information right then, but also knowing like, when are we getting to a point where maybe we're worried, and maybe having some professional support might also be warranted.
Yeah, interesting. So just being mindful of that, keeping tabs on that particular kid or children. Yeah. I've learned also from another podcast that depending on the stage of development of that young adult or teenager, that they might find solace or sense of community with people outside of their family. You know, it's normal for a teenager to really not want to hang around the house too much, but to go be with their buddies. Have you found that?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And, I think that with teens, their natural developmental stage is to be more peer focused. Sometimes the complexity is when there's something hard going on at home, such as a cancer diagnosis. Quite often their peers aren't really well equipped to be able to support them. It depends, but that's where I find, when there's possibilities of getting them involved in teen groups where other kids are in similar situations and everything. They're the hardest demographic to get in, to opt into like a teen group, but they benefit the most from it. And that's where, or even websites. I mean, the things with teens is sometimes when they find gaps, they create their own stuff where they create their own websites by teens who have somebody with cancer in their life, for teens with somebody with cancer in their life. And I find the thing that's really cool with kids and teens is like they do a beautiful job of balancing deep joy and deep sorrow, right? And it's so clear, Cynthia, when you talking about, the first time around with cancer, and like that was obvious. There was a lot of joy in there as well. And I think it's an important thing for people to be aware of, because I find a lot of people, it's not just the Terry Fox barrier. It's also, if I give my kids this information, I think they're going to be sad all of the time. And most kids, even when the hardest things go down in life, have this beautiful ability to weave joy and sorrow together.
Yeah,
Definitely.
yeah. And perhaps that applies maybe less so, but to young adults and adults. I mean, I'm thinking about when my father died, and we'd be in what one would think of as the worst of situations, and something small would happen, which would make us happy, for a period of time. I'd like to maybe touch on, Andrea, those children that are really having a difficult time and perhaps becoming depressed and requiring a psychotherapist to help them, or perhaps more appropriately, a physician to help them through this difficult time, addressing what is really depression. And maybe you can also comment on distinguishing grief and sadness from depression.
Yeah, and I'll just qualify, as a psychotherapist, I actually can't diagnose myself. So I would just, if I've got sort of some alarm bells going, I'd be like, let's get this kid assessed. But I do think that looking okay and doing well when you're contending with a difficult situation in life, like a mom having cancer, looks different than doing well otherwise, and we need to allow some room for really hard, big, sad feelings sometimes. I think one of the hardest parts of my job is convincing people that there's actually utility in doing suffering and doing grief sometimes, and letting yourself go to those dark places sometimes. And then the cool thing with kids is like they'll come out and be having fun 7 minutes later in a way that, as adults, we're not as good at. But if we've really got kids that we're worried they're withdrawing for a prolonged period of time, there's any self-harm, suicidal ideation, maybe not enjoying activities that they used to enjoy and things like that. If I've got kids who like love playing soccer and all of a sudden they're not going to play soccer anymore, my alarm bells start going. And I'm like, you know what, maybe we do want to get them to somebody to do more of an assessment as to whether there's some depression here. Even if there is, I want to make sure that they get good support. And the best support is really adults being able to model healthy grief. That as humans, I think we often underestimate our ability to do suffering and emerge from it, because it can feel so big and so hard sometimes. We think we're going to get stuck there. And it's not unusual to be like, oh, I was in a really dark place, and now I feel lighter. I feel like a little bit of a release. And actually teaching that to kids, I find to be a really valuable life lesson as well.
For sure, I'd agree. And so speaking then of helping your kids along, can you just speak to some of the resources that are out there?
Yeah, there's actually a fair bit now in terms of looking at how do we talk to kids about different illnesses. Canadian Virtual Hospice, kidsgrief.ca. These are all free resources. Once a month, I do a Q&A through Canadian Virtual Hospice, completely free. Any parent or any adult connected to a grieving kid can come, just ask their questions and we respond. Some really good books out there as well. Gilda's Club in Toronto is phenomenal as well for their groups for kids and teens and their summer camps. And so there really are resources. I know Canadian Virtual Hospice has put out a whole series of workbooks for kids as well, including kids who have cancer themselves as well. So really great stuff out there. And, I just always encourage families that if you're reading books on these topics, that they should be a conversation starter. They shouldn't be the conversation, right? Really, the goal is to open the conversation with kids, but then let them take the lead in terms of how much information they want and when do they want the information.
Yeah, that applies to so much, right? When especially, I guess, when our kids are younger, we're telling them what to do rather than them telling us what they should be doing. Yeah, but we need to facilitate that, trigger it, right? Yeah. Well, I feel like we've covered some really, really important aspects of this whole topic. And I'm so grateful, Cynthia, for you for being so forthcoming with your, beautiful experiences with your two daughters, who do sound pretty phenomenal.
They're pretty amazing, I think.
Yeah, I'm sure they are. And Andrea, thank you so much for your input. It was a pleasure speaking with you today. And thank you for all the great work that you do with your organization.
Thank you.
All right.
And thank you. Thank you for starting this conversation.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome. I hope you have a great day and that perhaps we'll meet again. Take care.
Bye-bye.